across some information lately that's kind of related to our conversation on Frankenstein. When there's an early part of Frankenstein where Victor the doctor is studying alchemy and other old science, getting the ideas of what he's going to do. And you may have seen at the time, I'm not sure if we talked about Paracelsus, who was a medieval alchemist who was trying to grow homunculi in beakers. And the thing is, a few weeks ago, I listened to a podcast is Distillations out of Philadelphia's Science History Institute. It was all about how this guy, Paracelsus, same guy, he did occupational medicine for miners. He was studying the health of miners. He was in Germany. There was a whole lot of mining going on, and it was very, very bad. They didn't know anything about protections, using masks or any of that. And he did long-term familial studies on miners. And I had no idea that someone who had this wacky homunculi thing was also really a very caring doctor who gave away a lot of his labor for free to poor mining families. And some of his detailed notes were useful later for occupational medicine studies. So I just thought that was neat, and it goes to show you never know. Someone may be rather eccentric in some ways, and yet also a thoroughly decent human being who helps other people.
Well, there's a lot of different, I could go in about 20 different directions in that conversation. So I'll go in 5. One was Sir Isaac Newton, who is arguably the greatest scientist, the greatest scientific mind that has ever lived. And probably would not have published the Principia Mathematica unless he was pushed to do so by other people. And after he published it, spent most of the rest of his life trying to find mathematical sequences hidden in the Bible, analyzing the Bible for mathematical I'm messing this up, but he really spent a lot of time doing that. So that's sort of like the opposite direction. The other thing is about mining in Germany at that time. You could dive into a guy called Agricola, which just means farmer. It's just a Latin word for farm, but his name was Bauer. I think it's Georg Bauer. And he wrote a book called De Re Metallica, which is sort of an epic book because it was the first sort of DIY manual of how to do mining. It showed how to do everything with mining, how to dig the mine, how to build the water pumps, do all this kind of stuff. It was like the first whole earth catalog for doing mining, and he gave it it became a very, 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 very famous book. And the third thing, it also reminds me of too, and there actually may be another thing, is Clemenceau, who was Clemenceau was the French leader during World War I. And was the leader of France during the Treaty of Versailles. And he started as a doctor to very poor people. And tended to extremely poor people, was sort of a radical politician and a real gadfly, and then became like this furious person. He's the guy who said, Germany's going to pay big time for this whole thing. So yeah, it's really interesting about, and then last one, sorry, Henri Poincaré, a famous French polymath from the 1800s, late 1800s. And one of the things you had to do if you went to the École Polytechnique in France, if you went to, which is the great science school, one of the great science schools in France, one of the things you had to do is you had to do sort of a public works project. You had to do something useful. And he went and analyzed this massive mine disaster that occurred in France, where something exploded and killed all these miners. And he went there and he really determined what went on and came up with mechanisms and policies to fix it going forward. Really, that's from a book I read, which is a fabulous book called Einstein's Clocks, Poincaré's Maps. Fabulous, fabulous book. So anyway, that's the last time you ever say anything about Paracelsus. I think we're done, right? We're good. Can we roll the end credits now?
Yeah, thank you both for being here. It's been really educational for me. Okay. Sarah Elkins is joining us today as guest. We are live on Patreon. We offer the live broadcast to members of my Patreon, which is patreon.com/JimInfantino, which goes to support the podcast, but also a lot of other things that I'm doing. I see that we have one viewer in there, but I don't know whether they can actually hear it because this is still kind of early stages for getting the live to work. So apologies. And I know you can't hear my apology if you can't hear it, but if you want to support the podcast, please consider going to patreon.com/JimInfantino. And that keeps the podcast independent, and we don't need to run advertising in order to pay for our expenses and such. Sarah, welcome. It's good to have you back. You're a regular on the podcast, Funny Not Funny. And we had an assignment that you actually brought up because I had mentioned this guy, I think. Can you tell me kind of what your thinking was when like how Sure. I got excited when you mentioned it, but you must have had some kind of thought about it.
So you had mentioned Bernardo Kastrup, and it had sounded to me like you were interested in some of his ideas. I didn't know anything about him, and I went and looked up just enough on public information about Bernardo Kastrup to realize he was an author, a philosopher, a computer scientist. And back in college, one of my majors were computer science and philosophy. And I saw that this guy had written about metaphysics, about a particular kind of metaphysics, analytic idealism, and that he had written about Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer is one of the philosophers I studied in college who I felt was underappreciated.
Okay.
We can talk about that more, but so I reached out saying, I'm up for reading one of these books. And you wrote back and said, let's read these two. So
well, they do repeat each other a bit. I mean, I thought they kind of, I actually found the Schopenhauer book much more interesting than the In a Nutshell book, which I thought was making a very
we'll talk about that
fervent argument. Yeah. Where should we start? I mean, maybe what I didn't know was,
Lionel, were you engaged at all in the topic or more along for the ride? Sure. Did anything sing out to you when Jim and I started talking about discussing this guy?
You mean at the outset?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
I didn't know. I know zero about Schopenhauer. I know zero about Kastrup. I know zero about analytic idealism. So no, I had no preconceived notions going into this
thing. Yeah. Where should we?
I think it might make more sense to start with Schopenhauer first.
I agree.
We can explain the relevance to Kastrup and the analytic idealism, but Schopenhauer comes first chronologically.
And for people who don't know, I don't even know his first name. His last name. What's that?
Arthur Schopenhauer.
Arthur
was a philosopher. I studied him in 19th century German philosophy in college, and he was very concerned with the world and what is it and how can we know what it is, and so sort of metaphysics, epistemology. And he
came ontology in a sense,
yes,
right?
Yes, ontology. And he came up with his own ideas, sort of following off of Immanuel Kant and other philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
But he he didn't make a huge splash when he wrote, and Kastrup actually talks about maybe some of the reasons why it didn't catch on a lot at the time. But as time went on, he had more and more influence on not just philosophers but also uh, others, and we can get into that. So he had growing influence as it went on, but he was struggling with the idea of what the world is and our relationship to it. So,
And his conclusions are very unusual, I think, for the time, because I think everybody had kind of taken Descartes' word for it, and Schopenhauer was unwilling to do that. Schopenhauer was going to say, no, I'm going to look at it again, and his conclusions philosophically were wildly different, I think, than, well, I would classify them, from what I can understand, as wildly different. The irrational, what is it? The irrational nature, or the irrational will of the natural world, and that everything boils down to will, and that we observe. Yes, it twists the brain, and then on top of that, we get Bernardo Kastrup's interpretation of Schopenhauer, which twists the brain even further. I mean, it's the kind of stuff that I love because I have to work really hard to see it.
this was definitely a tough read. I'm just pausing a little in case Lionel wants to jump in.
No. Be my guest.
So,
No, go. No, you first.
For people who don't know, talking about sort of, and yes, opposition to Descartes and other popular views of the time. Descartes was a dualist, body and mind, two
Right.
different things. And Kastrup says during his take on Schopenhauer, is that Schopenhauer was not a dualist.
Correct.
There was no body; it's all mind.
Right.
Now, that's not to say it's all hallucination. He was not a solipsist.
Right. Or a nihilist.
Right, not a nihilist. But my memory from college is that a lot of people people at the time and my fellow students found Schopenhauer as very dark and grim because atheist, and a lot of people just find that super grim and repellent. Fewer people now, of course, but back then, yeah.
His portraits, though, when he's older, his portraits are maybe the surliest of any human being that have ever lived.
He's got kind of a beaked nose. He looks like you could get into a bar brawl with him or something like that.
He's looking for a fight.
When I was reading him in college, he didn't seem that dark to me. And I remembered that either he had said or someone summing him up that I read at the time had said that the more someone knows about themselves, the better they understand how connected they are within the universe. The more you understand yourself, the better you understand how connected you are with the universe. And I liked that a lot.
Yeah.
That's stuck with me since then, and it seemed when I read this book, Kastrup's view, that seemed, I didn't say, oh, I remembered it wrong. It seemed to align with my reading of the story. So I've had some affection for Schopenhauer since then. Maybe a little bit of an underdog thing.
Yeah, well, he did have a huge influence on Nietzsche, as I understand.
Yes.
And then Nietzsche had a huge influence, for good and bad, on people like Heidegger and, so, which then, of course, led to horrific world events. But I don't think we can pin that on Schopenhauer. I think Schopenhauer should be blameless in this. Now, but it's one thing, so I haven't read, I really never read Schopenhauer, even though I really did love philosophy. And now I do want to go back and read some. But I definitely didn't know, and you might know better, how much of the book that Kastrup wrote on Schopenhauer is Schopenhauer and how much of it is Kastrup. Because he seems to be willing to bend a lot towards his ontology of mental states.
So I didn't go back and compare to old texts of Schopenhauer. Kastrup seemed to be delighted that when he went and read Schopenhauer, it seemed to align a lot with his ideas about analytic idealism. He was
Right.
saying, "Oh my gosh, this guy, over 100 years ago had some of the same ideas I had." And yes, I think he has his own interpretations of some of what Schopenhauer is saying. He was saying that Kastrup said that Schopenhauer was writing in a somewhat colloquial style. So modern analytic philosophy, this I'm sure of, is very it it's a very precise discipline. It cares a lot about the meanings of words and tries to come up with very coherent and consistent explanations. And Schopenhauer, Kastrup said, think of him more as someone having a really long conversation with you in a bar. And some of his words may shift a little depending on the context of what he's talking about at that particular time in the conversation in the bar. Well, that's nice for Kastrup because then he can say, in this paragraph, Schopenhauer meant this, but over here, he meant that other thing by the same word. And he may be absolutely right, but uh, uh, Kastrup is a pretty scrappy guy. And, I would use the word pugnacious. And so he kind of gets into academic disputes with other people based on what he calls their misreadings of Schopenhauer. So none of us are PhD philosophy people, and even if we were, we'd still have each of our own opinions on what it all means.
Right. Wait. Who was the philosopher who? I'm sorry, the academic who interpreted Schopenhauer that Kastrup. Is that who you were talking about?
He named several.
Yeah. Okay.
So he named several later in the book when he was talking about correct reading of Schopenhauer. He mentioned several, and there was one. There is just nothing like academic snark.
Oh.
With there is a part where he's describing other philosophers' misunderstandings and misstatements as he saw them of Schopenhauer, and oh so kindly offering his help to set them straight. He said things like, analytic idealism is here to help you. And I know there were at least two of them, and I didn't put their names down because
I just didn't know if you recognized them
attitude. But he was really aggravated with one of them for calling Schopenhauer a dualist, which isn't the way I remember Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer was talking about the mind, that everything is will.
Well, I think it's a fair criticism to say that some what do I want to say, like critics or some other philosophers might try to cope with Schopenhauer's ontology by turning it back into a Cartesian or dualistic model. Surely Schopenhauer couldn't mean that the objects in the world are made of thought or will, right? Or that are the irrational will of nature. So he must mean by that the matter in the universe behaves as if it has an irrational will.
Right. And they may have been trying to read Schopenhauer generously from their lights. Surely he can't mean that. So
that's crazy.
What he must have meant. And that was kind of their way of trying to be nice to him. And of course, here comes Kastrup saying, you dummies, he said this and this is what he meant. And in his talking about what Schopenhauer really meant, he refers both to philosophers who were there before and a whole lot of things that came afterwards. And, and I can be pretty sure that Schopenhauer had absolutely no knowledge of Thomas Nagel's famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? I can
Right, of
talk
course.
about that, a very interesting work. But, when Kastrup is bringing in quantum physics, Claude Shannon's information theory,
Yeah, repeatedly.
from the information book that we read, and he's bringing in a lot of stuff that's newer. And what he's talking about is he's going at it in two different directions. One, he's going from the direction of here's the influence that Schopenhauer had building, and you can see it in later philosophy. And then in the other sense, he says, or not just philosophy. Then in the other sense, he says, look, we've gone into cognitive psychology and other things since then, and now this kind of sheds more light on how you can read Schopenhauer and have it be making sense. Because to someone who had never read about dissociative identity disorder, um, uh, some of what Schopenhauer was saying might seem super out there. And even though Schopenhauer never used that phrase,
right,
we have in our 21st century, at least some of us have run across some of these other concepts that have made it familiar enough that then when we look at what Schopenhauer was saying, we can say, oh, all right, that's not totally out there. That's kind of like Claude Shannon's information theory, or name your modern reference that Kastrup dragged in.
It's and I apologize for the noise that my parka is making. It's cold in here.
It was just at the beginning. It was at the very beginning when I was
but
talking.
also I'll just turn the gate up and it should be fine. All right, where was I?
Well, I was talking about the modern stuff that Kastrup brings
information theory,
interpretation. That Kastrup has his reasons for bringing them all up, sort of illustrating how more current ideas reflect Schopenhauer's ideas and can help us to understand possibly some of Schopenhauer's meatier concepts that he was getting at.
Yeah, well, I think that Kastrup is trying to show that Schopenhauer has borne out in profound ways, given the number of modern philosophers and some scientists that are taking the hard problem of consciousness seriously now.
Right.
And Kastrup has a solution,
right,
which he is not shy about explaining. And it's funny because I've seen him.
What is his solution? Seriously, I mean, that's the problem I have. Is like, okay, dude, so it's one thing to talk about, okay, the mind is will and the universe is mind and the mind is this and blah, 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 blah. But I got the same feeling I got when reading Tegmark's book, which is, the universe is just mathematics. There's no, that's all it is. And it's like, okay, and
right.
What do we do with this, ladies and gentlemen? I'm just not, it's never clear to me, like, okay, so we're getting ourselves in a lather here towards what end?
Right. I thought you might say that. Like, what's the point of this? How does it change anything? We're shifting from the universe is made of one thing to the universe is made of another thing, and the universe behaves exactly the same in both cases, with some very subtle changes at the quantum level. But aside from that, there's it's not like Kastrup is denying evolution. In fact, he talks about it all the time. He doesn't deny chemical reactions or molecular interactions or anything in science, except he doesn't believe that some of the problems in quantum physics are really problems given his model.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to talk more about why this matters.
Okay.
But I think that's addressed much more in the analytic idealism in a quote nutshell.
Why don't we jump back and forth? But because I think that they do interrelate the two books in some ways.
Okay, so I do want to sum up for people, for listeners.
Yeah.
So Schopenhauer's magnum opus was The World as Will and Representation. And to boil it down, to oversimplify, for Schopenhauer, everything is will, and we are all connected through a universal will. And things are represented to us. Our identities, we perceive things, things are represented to us. And through struggling to understand what those things are, how they're represented to us, what it all means, we get a better understanding of the will. And that comes back to what I was saying earlier, that the more we understand ourselves, the more we understand how we are connected to the entire universe. Now, that sounds very airy and abstract. Schopenhauer, of course, goes into this in a lot more detail, and so does Kastrup in discussing Schopenhauer, and then even more in his next book where he gets into that. But that's kind of what it boils down to. He's in opposition to dualists who say there is body and there is mind. He's not necessarily in opposition to earlier thought, which really wasn't getting into there was so much earlier thought about the soul and all of that, and they weren't necessarily making all these clear distinctions between, what's in your head and what's outside of your head.
Well, before then, there was the spiritual life, which was really relegated to churches, and he goes into that.
Right. A lot about ascetics, ascetics, people who sort of deny their bodies to try and get closer to God, or for whichever purpose they have for doing that.
Well, right, but the two realms belong to two different disciplines. One to the churches, and the other to the scientists.
Right.
Show me the arc. The arc that a ball makes when you throw it is different from what happens to my soul when I die. And it's like, well, that's not my department. Go down to the Catholic Church and ask. And the Catholic Church will be like, I don't know how the ball does whatever it does. Just go and talk to the scientists.
Yeah.
And then science began to take over both. Philosophy and science began to take over both. And Kastrup even says that that's where we end up with the hard problem of consciousness.
Right. So
we haven't necessarily finished with Schopenhauer, but Schopenhauer is right in the sweet spot for that, because it's all just beginning to coalesce at the time that Schopenhauer is writing.
Right.
I just derailed us.
No. I just want to say a little more that, Schopenhauer was trying to get across very deep and very counterintuitive ideas. We may disagree with the ideas, but for a lot of us, this whole everything is mental, that's,
right. It's totally mental.
It's not mental, it's very counterintuitive for a lot of people. And so in this book, Kastrup is trying to kind of get you to see what this whole idea is about.
Well, just to play something back to you, just let me try to plant some flags in the ground here.
Mm-hmm.
So they all hark back to Kant, Immanuel Kant, who wrote the Prolegomena on all future metaphysics and wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, one of the greatest unread books in the history of mankind. Everybody quotes it, nobody actually reads it. But Kant was coming from a very long tradition of the empiricists, Berkeley, Hume, Locke, and stuff like that. And they all say, okay, look, there's impressions. There is a mind, and the mind perceives things. We all agree that we perceive things.
Right.
Where do those perceptions come from? And Kant's sort of answer, his exploration, is that there is the Ding an sich, the thing in and of itself, which we perceive, but we have no idea what it is.
But I thought that Schopenhauer preceded Kant. Am I wrong about that?
Followed.
Schopenhauer was before Kant?
No,
No,
Schopenhauer
it was
was
after Kant.
Well, let's look it up. Come on, let's.
We need to look that up.
Come on, hit the books.
Because my understanding was that Kant was building on Schopenhauer, but maybe I'm totally wrong.
No, I don't think so. But watch me be wrong. That'd be a real torpedo to this conversation.
Cool. I can't look it up because my.
I'm going for it. Emmanuel.
Yeah, Critique of Pure Reason.
I just want to get his. Okay.
Yeah, Hegel came later.
Yes, Hegel came after Schopenhauer. Or they're contemporaries, but Hegel's a little later, I think, or a little before. I don't know, but I mean, the Critique of Pure Reason is what?
Okay, hold on. 1781.
Right. Okay, and then you have
Schopenhauer comes later.
The World as Will and Representation is 1818, so he's 30 plus
hot on the
years.
Heels, though. Yeah,
and then Hegel is the Phenomenology of Spirit by Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel is 1807.
Okay.
So Hegel and Schopenhauer are contemporaries. They're side by side. But okay, back to Immanuel Kant, who's a giant in philosophy, one of the absolute acknowledged giants, said, "Hey, look, there's the Ding an sich, which is the thing in and of itself. And we have no idea what it means." And one of the things that Immanuel Kant was trying to answer, because one of the problems with the empiricists like Locke and Berkeley and Hume is that it's incredibly reductionist to the point where the famous joke is "no matter, never mind." There's nothing. We are empty. And all we are is just a skull filled with sense impressions. And that's it. And there's nothing else there. There is no synthetic a priori conclusions, is the way it's put in the technical language of philosophy at the time, which is that the mind knows nothing. All it knows at the beginning, it's a blank slate. It's a tabula rasa, and then perception comes raining down on this empty tablet and starts filling our heads up. And Kant said, "Well, it's not that bad." And what he said is that there are these categories that the mind imposes to structure reality, and the most famous of which are time, space, and causality. He said the mind brings to the party a couple of things that are not. We don't get that from the outside. That's something that our mind supplies.
But that's fascinating because Kant didn't believe that time had an ontological reality, that it was subjective, and that space was the same. And that's very like Kastrup.
I don't know. I really, honestly, these are very weighty topics on which thousands and thousands of words have been written. So I don't, if you know that, great. I don't know that. All I'm telling you is I'm just sort of spieling off what I know. So the interesting thing, though, still with Kant is that there's something out there.
Mm-hmm.
And with Schopenhauer and Kastrup, it's like, no. Well, there's something out there. It's just more of what's in here. It's all mind. And it's all one thing.
It's totally mental.
It's
the best way to describe it.
It's in your head. Wherever you go, there you are.
Right. And your head is in your head. I mean, that's the thing, is you actually have to get your whole understanding
gotta watch out, because he'll
around
get pissed off at us, and then because
he's not going to notice us. He's so busy right now. Everybody's trying to talk to him. Seriously, he's very popular on the YouTubes right now. There's no way that he would care.
I wonder why. But the thing, though, to keep clear is that I think he very much. The 10% of the pages that I can actually bring myself to read in the book. One of the things is that, he said, it's the mind, our mind, our consciousness is not confined to a skull or something like that, is not confined to our brains. We are appendages. So, there's this kind of vibe of we are just simply extrusions of
dissociations.
Vast all-knowing universal mind. Oh,
that doorbell has been ringing all day, and I have no idea who's ringing it, honestly.
It's Bernardo. He's pissed.
Bernardo is
he's
here.
Down. He's got
he's like, stop. You have it all wrong.
Come here, you bastard.
Well, he comes off as so angry in his book. That in Mind in a Nutshell, analytic. He's so angry.
Not angry, contemptuous.
Yes, and that is not how he comes off when he's speaking to other scientists and philosophers. If you actually watch some of his, he's this very mild-mannered,
Yeah, it's just
calm, and friendly dude. But when
Oh,
he
that's
writes a
part of his
book,
battle
he's like,
armor.
say again.
I said that's part of his battle armor. I am sure that he goes into these debates that he's had, and I am smiling Bernardo. I smile and smile, and I stay with. Look at how consistent my philosophy is. I'll show you, how yours has gaps and inconsistencies in it, but I'll be smiling the whole time. I think that's part of his. He's combative in the books, but I think
Yes.
in live debates, he knows it comes off terrible to be a jerk, and so he kind of saves it for the books.
Yes, he's the perfect philosopher for the podcast age. He's the perfect philosopher for the age of engagement that we're living through right now.
But I don't think
that's a digression. But the key thing, though, is that I'm just trying to establish some ground rules here. That seems to be sort of like a really bedrock thing here. Is that Kant said there's something out there, and so did Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and a lot of people. And Schopenhauer seems to say we're much more interconnected. Like you said, that we're not dualists. Right. Whatever that means, we're all strongly interconnected, and saying that there's something out there is like the wrong thing to say.
Yeah. So what I'll say is that Schopenhauer was definitely not the first guy to be talking about phenomena versus noumena, perception, all of that. He was not the first to be talking about, and then he used the word reflection in his book, Will and Reflection, though I don't actually know what the German title is. But he was kind of the first that I'm aware of to say it's all mental, and Kastrup comes up with with a alternate wording or illustration, saying, think of it like it's all a river, and we're ripples in the river. So the river is doing ripples. So
whirlpools is what he also says, which is maybe
the river is doing ripples. So you're a ripple, I'm a ripple. Ripples can spawn other ripples. That's sort of how evolution happens, etc. So Schopenhauer was saying it's all the mind. It's all mental, and but then he went a lot into talking about perception, phenomena, reflections, etc. So and I would have to reread or read a lot more Schopenhauer than I did in college to be really sure about what the lines are between what Kastrup is saying that Schopenhauer is saying and what I believe that Schopenhauer is saying. For instance, I understand why Kastrup started talking about dissociative identity disorder, and for those who haven't read the book, it's got some disturbing imagery there about real DID.
Why that story he keeps repeating?
Exactly. I don't think it had to be that graphic or nasty, but anyway, but Schopenhauer was definitely talking about how we're different from each other, and why don't I know the same things that you know, Jim? Because we're all one mind, right?
Right.
And so Schopenhauer's getting into that question of how we are different alters of the will. And
now, did Schopenhauer use the term alters? Because that's what I couldn't figure out from Kastrup's.
Dig into and find that out. Because
I thought that was just an overlay that.
That was an overlay of Kastrup, but I don't know the term that Schopenhauer used. But Schopenhauer was talking about, well, if we're all one mind, how is it that you're you and I'm me and we're not the same person? And then Kastrup also brings in quantum physics, quantum behavior and perception, and that stuff was really interesting to me. But he also talks about it in the second book, and we should probably move on to talking more about the analytic idealism.
Right. which you don't actually get to what is analytic idealism until chapter 7, and there's about 9 chapters in the book. The first the first 6 chapters are a diatribe against what he calls physicalism. And I've thought about this. It really annoyed me. Any philosopher who uses the term infantile or ridiculous in a critique of the opposition just seems to disqualify himself. However, I think that what is fair in terms of his powerful rejection of physicalism is that all idealists for the past 200 years have been laughed out of the room. And what he's trying very fervently to say is the philosophy with the greater with the more vague metaphysics is physicalism, not idealism. Idealism is more, what is the word he uses? Parsimonious than physicalism, which proposes a type of reality structure that the mind can't, that our perception cannot touch or prove or ever justify the existence of, except through supposition. And he's right. And so he's kind of trying to get over the idealists are all crazy. And he just tries a little too hard, I think.
So, yes. So, and I should say, I don't know Kastrup. That stuff I was saying about him going into, debate, smiling, Bernardo and all that, that's just me guessing. I don't know. But I can tell that he's pretty bugged at being dismissed as a spiritualist.
Which no doubt he was, right?
Sure.
I mean, to get taken seriously with the ideas that he has could not have been pleasant. And he is being taken seriously now. So, cool.
Right. So I agree that if I see a book title called Analytic Idealism in a nutshell, I do not expect to have gotten through 50% of the book without actually having seen a simple layout of what it is. So I understand he was trying to give sort of historical context about how we got here and why physicalism has been so predominant. But I do think more in the first part about, I think what he was doing was, it's possible he was concerned that people would look at a simple summary first chapter and say, well, this is just spiritualism, and throw it away and not look at the rest of it. So he was trying to engage early with some of the objections to physicalism. But yes, he sincerely thinks his analytic idealism, and he seems to be the main guy.
There are a few, but
for it, I've certain analytic philosophy, much bigger strain of modern, primarily American philosophy. What I was talking about with it being a very strict discipline of use of language, coherent and consistent arguments, supposed to be, as far as possible, consistent with empirical testing and results that we've had. So that's analytic philosophy. Analytic idealism, when I first saw that was what he was doing, I was wondering, is this related to Platonic idealism, where there are these universal forms? Right. And no, not really.
No.
So I'm not quite sure why idealism, but anyway, that's the phrase he's using. The ideation, I'm not sure. Anyway, well,
he could have put out the Tractatus Idealismo Analyticus, and you started with 1.0. The physical world is a representation of the real world, which is mental. And then just continue with his propositions all the way through. But he didn't. He wanted to deconstruct the materialist notion, and I don't know why he says physicalism. Maybe that's the real term now. I've always thought of it as materialism, the belief that there is solid matter out there. And it's a metaphysics. The main thing that he could have pointed out more clearly is The thing that we take for granted as being the truth about reality is a metaphysics, and we think that it is not. But when we examine it, it absolutely is. And that's powerful to me. But the way he put it, less so.
What were you going to say, Jim? Sorry, Lionel. You were about
Nothing
to say.
important. The only thing I was going to say is that if you look at the first sentence of Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, the first sentence is the world is all that is represented, or something like that. And I was like, Wittgenstein, you little son of a bitch.
He stole it.
You're a thief.
Stole it.
You put a little 1.0 in front of it.
That's right.
You think you're a big man. The world is all that is the case. Take that, Friedrich. No, it's really interesting, like you mentioned. And then I realized that also Tractatus Logico Philosophicus is a nod to Spinoza, whose main book was the Tractatus Religio Philosophic. I mean,
they both.
We're slaughtering the greats of philosophy left and right here tonight.
That's a valid point, though. I mean,
yes, you're not. You guys are much more. You guys are much more genteel.
But this is not. This is aimed at the general public. This book, the nutshell. Yeah, the Schopenhauer stuff, I think is more fun because it sheds light on a
read.
Yeah, on a philosophy that most people overlook. But in the nutshell thing, yeah, he's talking to people who don't read philosophy. He's trying to he's reaching out to psychologists and just anybody who wants to take a different stab at the way things work, or the way things
guys
are
involved. Like there's Tegmark, which he dismisses as a hand waver.
That's the everything is math.
Yeah, which I thought was, boy, they must clang when you walk. You're dismissing Max Tegmark as hand waving. Whoa, dude.
And so, let me. What he says about Tegmark, the everything is math idea, and is roughly saying, well, there's no math without minds, and so everything is mental.
Mental, yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty neat little judo trick. But that's what his discussion of Tegmark boils down to.
Yeah.
There is no math without minds to perceive math.
And I got the same.
It's just a statement that and he's up front. This is not science.
Wittgenstein said similar things.
Theory that can be tested. These are philosophy theories. These are not science theories that are falsifiable. So Tegmark isn't falsifiable. Kastrup Analytic Idealism isn't falsifiable. He does come close to saying that materialism / physicalism is falsifiable because there's so many inconsistencies with modern neuroscience, with quantum physics. He lists in his chapters in the book, he goes through a bunch of examples of this is inconsistent with physicalist claims.
Not terribly convincing to me.
Tell me why, Lionel. Yeah, I was thinking of you during those.
He says, people having psychedelic experiences have much richer perceptions, but actually brain activity is reduced. Right. Ergo, that's a violation of the thing. First off the bat, I don't see that jump at all. I don't really know what he's talking about. He doesn't really explain it. I mean, there is a lot of hand waving, and there's a lot of short circuits and stuff. The thing I thought about was the wonderful thing I read about, which I'm probably repeating myself again, about the glasses that they designed, the chroma glasses that help people with color blindness. So people, they were discovered by accident. I think I sent you this podcast, a fabulous podcast. I think it was on like Planet Money or something like this. It was a series called Inventing Accidents, and it was discovered by mistake. A guy was developing glasses to help protect surgeons' eyes while they were using lasers. during surgery. And one day he was playing a Frisbee game with his friend who's colorblind. And his friend said, "Hey, those are really cool looking glasses. Can I try them on?" He says, "Yeah, go ahead." And the friend put them on and goes, "Holy crap, those cones are orange." And he's like,
Wow.
"Yeah, they're orange." He says, "No, they've been brown all my life. They're orange." And the way it works, and the reason why it works, is it takes away light. Because what happens is in your eyes, there are rods and cones. There are these cells that fire off when they receive certain frequencies. And the key to that is that they have to fire off in a very specific band of frequencies. If that band gets too big, they start firing off to adjacent frequencies. So not only firing off when they receive blue, they're also firing off when they receive ultraviolet,
So
when they receive violet, and that's bad.
They see too much color.
They see too much color. There's too many frequencies coming into your eye. So by actually reducing the frequencies coming into your eye, you actually get a richer perceptual thing, which is bullshit what I'm saying, but it's also bullshit what he's saying too. It's just like the whole thing is nonsense. It's just this whole idea that, oh, because there's less brain activity when people are having an acid trip, that means physicalism is dead. It's like, dude, seriously. Double slit experiment. Take a number and stand in line.
I think he purposefully does not mention the double slit experiment.
He talks about entangled photons.
Entangled photons, but not the double slit experiment, which is problematic. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm just saying there's so many people who have waded into that thing. And I think there are really, really very, very interesting things to be said about that. And I could go on forever, and I have in the past. But go ahead, Jim.
But yeah, let me, or Sarah. I mean, I think I'm on the side of arguing for Kastrup's metaphysics. I don't know where you stand, Sarah.
I do not. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a quantum physicist, but I do think that some of the points that Kastrup makes about how cognitive bias has heavily influenced science reporting to weigh in favor of what he would call physicalism, I think he's right. I mean, there's no doubt there's a lot of bias in science reporting, and that a lot of what they say is just flat out wrong in the face of evidence. You know, I'm very familiar with that from gender-biased science reporting. And there's this new book called Medicalizing Blackness about reporting as though it's a fact of things of like black high blood pressure, blah, blah, blah. There's been so much cognitive bias in science reporting. I can definitely get behind his statement that there's been a lot of bad reporting that has shored up what he would call the physicalist arguments, that the whole idea of this experiment he describes with we've managed to map down memory recall. And he goes into detail of how that's really sloppy reporting. No, we haven't. We've recorded that there's some brain activity. And that does not mean how we have activated the memory recall, et cetera. So I think, yes, some of his stuff in there is questionable. No doubt could argue with it. But I think some of what he has there is really pretty solid.
Actually, to your point, literally where he says that the results of the experiment of people who were on, it was LSD or psilocybin, the areas of the brain did not light up. The brain itself did not show any increased activity, even though there were heightened states of experience. And you would expect the brain to show more activity.
I just don't agree with that statement at all.
I know, but then what's interesting is the publications went on to say that there was more activity in the brain and that different areas of the brain did light up in direct opposition to the findings of the experiment. That's where he's proving bias against anything except a materialist reality.
Right. So I do want to do a little more defense of Kastrup. He doesn't wait. Jim said that he waited until the 6th chapter to actually talk about analytic idealism, but he does earlier. Chapter 2, what you see is what you get. That's his whole pilot cockpit analogy.
Yeah, that's true.
Discussion, which is saying imagine you're a pilot in a cockpit, and all you see are dashboard information. Certainly, early. Apollo, they were going to send them up without any windows at all because they said you can see it all through the dashboards. And his sort of very small intro to analytic idealism is saying, look, we're like pilots in a cockpit, and all we see are representations, and we don't directly perceive reality. It's a subjective experience. And what he's saying to begin with about analytic idealism is the really, really fundamental thing that we know is that we have experiences. That, he's saying subjective experience is the most fundamental thing we know. And of course, your
irreducible
experience is different from mine. And so it's difficult to do a lot of quantification and so on with that. But that's something that we know fundamentally, that you can argue, well, that's just hallucination or whatever, but then you get into is that solipsism and so on. So anyway, that's a tangent. I would say that
just one point to add. When you said quantification, he does insist that the universe, in his philosophy, the universe is made of qualities, not quantities.
Yes,
and I find that very interesting.
That's a big part of his later stuff. What he gets into later in chapters 6 and 7 and so on. That quantifiable is how we try to grapple with qualitative experiences, and talks about how heavy something is. If I say something is 20 pounds versus 50 pounds, that's a way to quantify. Picking up this one thing is a lot heavier than the other thing, and you can nail that down to quantifiable stuff, but what it's trying to get at is your subjective experience. I'm telling you, Jim, if you pick that thing up, it's going to be a lot heavier than this other thing.
Yeah.
And
at your age, don't do it, right? Yeah. Jim, don't do that at your age.
Be prepared. Bend your knees and all
Easy,
that.
Junior. Yeah. lift with your legs, not with your back.
This doesn't apply to Lionel. Lionel just
So
throws it over
for
his
me,
shoulder and up the stairs.
I had fun reading this. I don't really have a dog in this hunt. I do think it matters if our whole idea of what reality is influencing us to ignore certain problems, or influencing us to fund certain things and not other things because we think it aligns better with our idea of reality, then it does matter. Does it matter to me if, my neighbor believes in is a rock solid materialist and my neighbor on the other side is an analytic idealist or a pan-psych?
He's savage as the panpsychist.
I know.
And you'd think you're almost on the same side. What?
He's saying
but he's
they're really
no.
physicalists who are making something up about the mind.
It's like
and
People's Front of Judea.
About them is that's been a big branch of philosophy, and it's revolting to him because he thinks they're getting. I do not know Bernardo Kastrup, but I can see that there are a lot of what he's calling panpsychism. I'm not sure if that's what they call it.
That's the term, and there are two branches,
right,
and he hates them both.
What he's saying is, or what I see is that, yes, there are a lot of philosophers who get funding to teach this stuff at universities. And he's saying this is hooey because it's just kind of putting a little tap dance in front of physicalism to say, and here's how we explain the mind and consciousness. And he's saying this doesn't explain the mind and consciousness at all. So yeah, he devotes a whole chapter to savaging those guys.
You put a little sticker on the atoms that says consciousness, and then it solves the problem. I mean, that's the way he puts it. And maybe he's right about You know, I mean, I don't find the panpsychic argument, as far as I've examined it, to be very compelling. Whereas I think, you know, Kastrup's is, you know.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Jim, I talked over you.
No, that's fine. I did take some notes, and I know you took some notes, and I just want to share a little bit of kind of what I take away from what he's saying. And they're just bullet points. The first one, I don't want to read through them all of them, but I just see if I can find a, so one of the things he says, all there is a field of subjectivity that expands to the whole of nature, that extends to the whole of nature, a field of subjectivity. And that individuals' life are dissociations within that field of subjectivity. And I was like, what? Why? And then I realized it's like, it is a little bit like everything's a dream, except that it's a very well-structured dream that is very consistent, right? In which we are dissociated from it. In the same way, when you're in your dream, you're having a dream and you're driving a car and somebody else is racing you in another car, for example. This is not a dream I had, but, you know, or you're living in a house and there are other people in the house. Now, in that dream, you're a dissociation, because when you look at it, when you wake up, you realize, oh, yeah, I was the character in the dream. I was also everybody else in the house, and I was the house, because it was a dream that was all in my mind while I was sleeping. That's kind of, except larger and more structured, the state of things in Kastrup's world. We dissociate, and so we are living entities in a universe that is basically very structured but very low level intelligence, like a sleeper. And oh, shoot, there was a third point. And it's like reality is a negotiation between the internal and external mental states.
So if I had
a nickel for every time.
well, it is kind of related to that. You know, I'm really interested by these ideas, even though they don't matter to me personally. I wish that I knew more about some of the science that he talks about, because I'd like to have a better, more solid understanding of how much is what he's saying about experiments a total leap. Like Lionel is saying, you know, he may have some of it.
He may be right. I just don't see his argument as being as ironclad as he presents it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you're right. I think there are some places where we could really side-eye what he's saying, and really that's. I mean, I get what you're saying. I get what Kastrup is saying. That some of this stuff, some of the claims about what science has shown, is really not representing what science has actually shown in the experiments. You know, where like the biased science reporting and so on. But
he proves bias, but he doesn't necessarily prove that. We would have to go and read the results and also talk to somebody who really knew quantum physics to say that entangled particles reacting to each other over distance is the problem that he says it is, that is solved by analytic idealism.
Right. If I had time to go and read much more about the quantum entanglement Nobel prize-winning experiment in 2022, where Alice's observation of one property of a particle that's very far away affects another property of a different far away particle that Bob is watching. You know, if I had all the time in the world to delve into that, or to get more into the psilocybin, you know, the brain activity lighting up stuff, you know, I think Lionel is absolutely right that just because there's a lot of activity doesn't mean that there is no physical stuff. It doesn't mean that memory and mind processes are external to the physical world. but he's saying it sure doesn't show that it definitely is in the physical world.
Well, right. I mean, and
So,
he completely doesn't believe in the physical world. He believes in a mental world that behaves just like it is the physical world, to our perception, right?
yeah, I mean, I'd love to play with more of this. I do have
It's
full time.
it's kind of endless.
It's not this,
Yeah.
but I really enjoy. I mean, I know not this book is neither of these books are something that everyone would enjoy.
Absolutely
but
not.
I had fun with them, and maybe that's just nostalgia for college days and stuff. But I had fun reading these books and
I didn't.
seeing.
I did.
I didn't.
Well, Lionel,
I know.
you should get to pick the next book.
I'm just a sour. But I have two observations to make on this thing, which is one of them is so something I watched recently, which was recommended to me by my friend Bob, was a 2-part series on YouTube, which was, I think, done by the BBC, which is about minimalist music. It's called Tones, Drones, and Arpeggios. And it's hosted by this conductor who really gets on my nerves sometimes. But fundamentally, his heart is really in the right place. What was interesting, what I think sort of shines a light on this conversation, is that the classic story is that the minimalism of Philip Glass and Steve Reich and Terry Riley in the 1960s and 70s was to a certain degree, a hard reaction to the serial tone row music that was being taught in academic circles in America at that time in the conservatories.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we take that all as true, it's very interesting because tone row, serialist music is very strict in a way. It's kind of like haiku or some other art form where there's some very, very clear rules you can't break. And in the serial music of Arnold Schoenberg and Anton Webern, you have a tone row. You pick the 12 tones of the octave, and you use each tone, I believe, only once, and you have to play them all in a row. And you get that tone row, and that's what you can do. But I think you can do like retrograde inversion. You can use all the fugal tools of flipping notes and whatever. The key thing, it doesn't really matter. The key thing is that it was a very, very specific, comprehensible, simple constraint placed on the music. And the minimalist guys said, yeah, okay, not for me. And they did their thing. And they are seen as sort of a rejection of serialism, which is funny because if you look at Terry Riley's In C, which is one of the famous minimalist pieces of music, it's called In C by Terry Riley. It's, I think, 12 motifs. It's actually 12 players. It's a number of players. And they each get a little motif, like 5 notes or 7 notes. And then there's rules, like the game of life. There's rules. You can't come in more than 2 measures before the person who has the motif following yours, blah, blah, blah. You can play twice as fast or half as fast and stuff like that. And the same thing with a lot of the minimalist guys. It's almost like this IKEA music. You get your little wrench and you get your little bag of parts and you assemble something, and the guy next to you is assembling something. And you can really see this very clearly with much greater virtuosity in Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians. There's a fabulous recording on YouTube of a performance in Japan. I highly recommend everybody watch that. I cry when I watch it. It's so beautiful. But it's about making music. It's about manufacturing music. And it's very regimented, which is interesting because it's barring that. It's just like serialism. It's just like you have this constraint, you have these rules, and by following those rules closely, it sort of frees you a bit. So what I always find fascinating when we see people like Bernardo Kastrup, pushing, saying this is all nonsense and I have the right view and stuff like that. The idea that this, that all we have is sense perception, that goes a long way back. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
Like Plato in the cave. And I'm sure Plato ripped it off of a bunch of other people. It goes way, way, way back.
It goes back to the Vedas. I mean, the Vedas pretty much said everything Kastrup said, except in a religion.
And the problem I have, there's 2 problems. There's some other complaints I have, is that it just seems like Kastrup is really trying to import a lot of other arguments in on the side. Whenever he talks about physicalism, he always mentions the bourgeois worldview, the bourgeois capitalist worldview. I'm like, okay. There's another agenda going on.
There's a side gig.
There's a side gig. There's another agenda going on here. And then there's also he has this, you can see where he's trying to go with this, which is that, physicalism and dualism and the current, reigning paradigm drains life of meaning. Which is that, it's materialistic. Everything is just balls bouncing against each other. So therefore, if you know the position and velocity of every ball, then you know exactly how the game's going to turn out, which means there is no free will and there is no this and no that. And all throughout the book, he every now and then he stops his nonstop tirade against his supposed rivals. And every now and then pops his head above the foxhole and starts to wax eloquent about, the feeling of regret or the pang of inspiration and stuff like that. It's like, okay, so where are we going with this? It just seems like really a lot of this discussion is really, he wants to re-inject spirituality and meaning into life, which I think is a perfectly noble endeavor. And he says a lot about Indian philosophy. I read something where he said, basically what I'm talking about, the Indus Valley had it like 4,000 years ago.
Yeah, Brahman is the same as like the giant sleeping, natural, the irrational will of the natural world, and Brahman, it's like very similar.
Yeah. So I find it's funny how when people like revolt against things, they sort of incorporate the things that they're revolting against. That, when they think they're really pushing away from something, they're actually moving along an axis. They're not really rejecting something. And also, fundamentally, it just seems, there's people who say, look, everything is just a video simulation. Everything's just a simulation in a computer. And I'm like, okay, there's no way to unprove that. There's no way to disprove that. It's just like, what do I do with that? Like, how does this help me?
I think this is so on a scale of not very serious to more serious. We have the panpsychic people and the panpsychists, and the simulationists. Kastrup, I believe, is much more advanced and well thought out in terms of his ontology. And the thing is, though, it just takes weeks and weeks to get your head around it.
Huh.
Because it's very challenging to revise the way we see the world from very young age.
Okay. I will just simply, because I know we've discussed this many times before, which is the whole idea of what is a scientific theory. And what lies underneath, the thing that I'm fascinated by is you can teach mathematics to somebody without teaching them any mathematics because it's just symbols on a page. When you see this thing that looks like a 4 and you see a plus sign and you see a 4 and then 2 little horizontal lines, you complete it by putting this character that has 2 circles, one on top of each other. You could teach somebody to do mathematics. You could teach somebody all of mathematics without ever teaching them what we think of as mathematics. There's all these mind constructs that we apply to things, so that we apply to natural phenomena. We say, just like Aristotle, the teleological principle, the ball falls towards Earth because that's its purpose. And everything falls towards the center of the Earth because that's their purpose, is to go to the center of the Earth. Well, we don't think of it that way anymore. But to a certain degree, it doesn't really matter because all you really care about in a practical sense, in a lot of ways, is the equations. Do you have an equation that will tell me where this missile is going to land? Because that's like really important to me, that this missile land in this particular spot at this particular time.
No, I think nothing really contradicts that. It's like what you said, is the church wanted Galileo to tell them when Easter was, goddammit, right?
Right.
That they needed to know how to figure out what the calendar was going to be like. And like Don Smith came on here and said, if you want to know what's real, go down the hall to theology. We're going to tell you what works.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing changes in terms of, whether you believe in Kastrup or you believe in...
Now, just to contradict myself, everything does change because it changes how you view the world and how you interpret it. And it does matter if you know what mathematics is. And the other thing I'm fascinated by, I'm just spewing all this stuff out because I think it's really related to is, I'm not. I could keep going forever and worry over time. But the key thing is that... What? Yeah, we're like 15 minutes past. Anyway, I'll stop there. Sarah, you're our guest. You go ahead.
Oh, final word, Sarah, if you have one.
I think my favorite part of any of the reading was the headless planarian memory experiment, where they taught a planarian, a little organism, how to travel some terrain. I've loved planarians since high school.
Who doesn't?
They look like little baby sharks, hammerhead sharks swimming around in things. And so they taught these planarians how to navigate a certain terrain, and then they chopped their heads off.
Like you do.
Right. So all their neurons gone.
Yep.
So as planarians do, they regrew heads and then were able to travel that same terrain again. And, of course, Kastrup thinks this means, see, it's,
right.
Our minds are not.
The body is made of thought.
Our brains.
Yeah.
But, whatever it means, I feel.
You feel sorry for the planarians.
For the planarians, but I just love the way that by God or by whatever mysterious process, they were able to regrow their heads and keep going on that terrain without a problem. So that, I don't know, I smiled and smiled when I read that. So
justice for the planarians, I say. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us and taking on the hard problem of our podcast, and I appreciate you.
Well, thanks. I enjoyed preparing. I took a lot of long walks listening to these books on audio, and then would go home and take notes. And beautiful fall walks, listening to some pretty deep stuff. So
cool.
Thank you for the discussion.
Sure.
Thank you. Funny Not Funny is produced by Jim Infantino at Slab Media in Boston. Jim Infantino and Lionel Casson are the co-hosts. Our website is funnynotfunny.net. The theme music is from the song Wheel from the album Utopia Revisited by Jim. The opinions presented by the co-hosts are ridiculous and should not be taken seriously by anyone. Our intended audience is literally nobody. If you're listening to this podcast, you should probably pause to reflect on other choices you've recently made. Please do not subscribe or leave a rating or review. It only encourages us to make more. Thanks for listening.